passage from the Gospel of Matthew. Listen to these words from Matthew 14, verses 13 through 21. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." Jesus said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So let me ask again, don't you think the disciples were asking, how on earth are we going to feed all these people? It seems like a legitimate question to me. The disciples were faced with a big problem that day. An enormous crowd of people had followed Jesus to a remote place. What on earth were the disciples going to do? Send the people on their merry way, that's what. But that's not what Jesus wanted, and we know it's not what happened. Today's story of the loaves and fishes is found in all 4 Gospels, so obviously it's an important story. It was clearly important to the early church. Some scholars have suggested that this story was read regularly when early Christians gathered to take communion. Others say this story is important because it echoes the story of God's provision of manna from heaven for the children of Israel. Now you remember that story, don't you? The Israelites had fled from Egypt and were wandering in the desert for a very long time. They were hungry and cried out to God. God answered their cry and sent them manna from heaven. The Israelites had never seen anything like manna before, so they had no idea what it was. They just knew it was something food-like, and they were hungry, and so they ate it, and it satisfied their grumbling bellies. Now, whether today's story was actually used as a communion meditation, or it was an echo of the story of manna for the Israelites, the most important thing about this story for the early church is that it became a source of deep hope and inspiration for Christians seeking to be faithful against great odds. It is a story of love, compassion, and hospitality in the extreme. When I've preached on this passage in the past, my focus has always been the miracle of the loaves and fishes. But today I want to spend some time with verse 13. Listen again to what Matthew writes. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. What news had Jesus heard? The answer isn't in today's passage, but comes just before it. Jesus had learned of the murder of John the Baptist. And when he heard this horrifying news, did he immediately start plotting revenge against Herod? Did he tell the disciples, maybe we should rethink this thing we're doing? Did he get angry? Which would have been understandable. No, he didn't do any of those things according to Matthew. When Jesus learned that his beloved cousin John had been murdered, he went off to be alone. Matthew tells us, now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. Jesus needed time to process what he'd heard. He needed time to rest. He needed time to recharge. But more than anything, he needed time to grieve, just like anyone else who has lost someone they love. Grief can be a tricky thing. Anyone who is grieving now or has ever grieved can tell you that grief does not follow a straight line. What I mean is you don't start at point A and then move directly along the path in a straight line to point B and then to point C and so on until you get to point Z and then poof, you're done grieving. That's not how it works, is it? A dear friend once shared the expression grief bursts with me. What happens is that the grieving person is just going along, taking care of the everyday stuff, thinking he or she has things under control, and then wham! Something, some person some sight, some smell, some sound, some song, some memory triggers the pain of their loss, and they find themselves right back in the throes of grief once again. The grieving process is different for every person. There is no right way to grieve, and there's no fast track to get past one's grief, because in reality, the grief never completely goes away. But with time, it becomes manageable, and the grief bursts happen less and less frequently. Why am I talking about grief today, you might be wondering? Why not preach about the loaves and fishes? The reason is because I think our world is grieving right now. People are grieving the loss of loved ones due to the coronavirus. Death is a horrific part of this pandemic, but it's not the only part, is it? People all over the world are also grieving what they've lost. The loss of income, their jobs, their freedom, their independence, their sense of security. People are grieving the loss of their simple day-to-day routines, their ability to travel, to go out to eat, to hang out with friends. People are grieving the way they used to be able to gather in churches and synagogues and mosques. They're grieving the normal start of a school year. Here in our country, people are lamenting their lack of faith in the leaders on both sides of the political aisle. Beyond the enormous loss of life around the globe, people are grieving the way things used to be. Every single day we are bombarded with more statistics, more warnings, more precautions, more restrictions, more changes. Our new normal is what we're trying to figure out every moment of every day. And in the midst of all this is our grief. What do we do with it? Where do we go with it? How are we supposed to get through this when there's no end to this pandemic in sight? I'm afraid I don't have the answers to those questions, but I will say that I think our best bet is to turn to each other, lean on each other, share our burdens with each other. Grieving isn't something that we should do all alone. We are better together than we are apart. We are stronger, we're more resilient, we're better able to see the big picture when we're not so focused on our tiny piece of it. Together, we can manage our grief. Together, we can find hope. In today's passage, Jesus desperately needed time to grieve and regroup. He needed a little time alone, but he didn't get that time and space he needed because the people heard that he had left and they followed after him. They just couldn't get enough of him. Jesus came into the shore and saw the great crowd. If I were Jesus, I might have thought to myself, seriously? Can't I just have 5 minutes to myself? But that's not what happened, of course. Matthew tells us Jesus had compassion for the people and cured their sick. To me, this is where the actual miracle in today's story began. Jesus took his weary, exhausted, grieving self right back to the crowd, back to the community that he loved. He rejoined the people, showing them love and giving them reasons to hope. What shall we do now, my friends? How shall we deal with our grief? There is no hiding it. There's no denying it. We can be angry about it, about all the things that are causing us to feel this way, or we can choose to handle it in a different way. We can name our grief for what it really is. And once we recognize that it's grief that we're feeling, we can then share it with the people that we love because they're grieving too. Grieving is not meant to be done alone. We may not all be in the exact same boat, but we are all in the same storm. Don't forget, you're not alone. God is also right there with you, paddling right alongside you. Take time to grieve. It's healthy and it is necessary. May God bless you in this journey. Amen. Stay safe, stay well, and never forget how much you are loved. Have a great week.